April 1945, Okinawa. A 19-year-old Japanese girl kissed an American soldier in a typhoon. He could have taken everything. Instead, he pushed her away and said three words that saved her life. "I can't. Go." 2 weeks later, she found his journal in a box of dead men's belongings. The last page was soaked in blood, and it contained a secret that would take her 7 years to deliver to a small house in Dayton, Ohio. Yuki Shimizu had been taught that American soldiers were Hakujin devils, white demons who would torture Japanese women before killing them. The emperor's radio said so. Her teachers said so. Even her own mother, before she disappeared in the naval bombardment of Naha Harbor, had whispered the final warning. If the Americans come, you must die with honor. Do not let them touch you. Better to join the ancestors with dignity than to live as their plaything. But Corporal Thomas Brennan didn't touch her. He threw her food and walked away. And that moment of mercy, that single impossible act of restraint, shattered everything she'd been taught to believe about the white devils from across the Pacific. This is the story of how propaganda met reality in the caves of Okinawa, how a soldier's refusal became a young woman's salvation, and how one blood-stained journal carried a message across an ocean 7 years later to a mother who thought her son had died for nothing. If you or someone you love served in the Pacific, you know these stories aren't often told. But this one needs to be. Before we go further, hit that like button if you believe one act of honor can change a life. And subscribe, because this channel is dedicated to the untold stories of the greatest generation. Now let's go back to April 1945, when the Battle of Okinawa was turning the island into hell on earth. Operation Iceberg, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific Theater. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. commanded the United States 10th Army. Across the coral ridges and ancient burial caves, General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded the Japanese 32nd Army. Between them, over 300,000 Okinawan civilians were trapped in a vice of artillery, naval bombardment, and a desperate grinding infantry war that turned the beautiful island into a landscape of mud, blood, and smoke. Buckner's strategy was methodical attrition. Take every ridge, every cave, every village. The Japanese had fortified the southern shoreline into a subterranean fortress. Thousands of interconnected tunnels and fighting positions carved into the ancient coral. Machine gun nests that could pour fire from 3 different angles. Mortar pits hidden in the jungle canopy. And everywhere, the caves. Ushijima's strategy was simpler and more terrible. Delay. Make the Americans pay in blood for every yard. Make the impending invasion of the Japanese homeland so costly that Washington would reconsider. Every day the 32nd Army held the Shuri Line was a day that bought time for the emperor, for the divine wind, for the miracle that would turn the tide of the war. But there was a third army on Okinawa, the civilian population. And they had been weaponized by something more insidious than bullets. They had been weaponized by fear. For months, the Japanese government radio had broadcast the same message into every home, every school, every village square. The Americans are coming. They are not soldiers. They are beasts. They will torture your sons. They will defile your daughters. They will make your women into comfort slaves passed from soldier to soldier until they are broken and discarded. Death is honorable. Capture is worse than death. If the Hakujin devils come, you know what you must do. Yuki Shimizu was 19 years old when the propaganda became reality. She had been a student at the Shuri Girls' School. Then the mobilization came. The Himayuri Student Corps. Every able-bodied young woman between 15 and 20 was drafted as auxiliary nurses for the Imperial Army. They gave her a white headband with the red sun, a small medical kit, and orders to report to a field hospital carved into a hillside near Shuri Castle. She had worked there for 3 weeks. The wounded kept coming. Soldiers with missing limbs burned shrapnel wounds that turned their bodies into landscapes of torn flesh and exposed bone. The morphine ran out after the first week, the bandages after the second. By the 3rd week, they were using torn sheets and prayer. When the American artillery found the hospital, Yuki had been changing the dressing on a soldier who kept asking for his mother. The first shell hit the entrance. The second collapsed the main chamber. Yuki ran. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just ran through the smoke and screaming into the jungle, her white uniform covered in other people's blood. She found the tomb by accident. A traditional Okinawan kamyobaka, a burial cave carved into a limestone hillside near the village of Urasoe. The entrance was small, hidden behind a tangle of vines and coral rock. Inside, she found others. Women, children, a few elderly men too old to fight. They had all fled the advancing Americans. They huddled in the dark with the bones of the ancestors waiting for the end. Among them was Haruko Yamada, 34 years old. She had lost her husband in the naval bombardment, her two children in an artillery strike, her parents in the fighting retreat from the Machinado airfield. Haruko had nothing left but the certainty of the emperor's words, and she had a razor blade wrapped in a piece of cloth. When they come, Haruko whispered in the perpetual twilight of the tomb, we must use this. It is our last dignity. It is our duty to the emperor. We cannot let the white devils take what belongs to the divine nation. The tomb smelled of mold and fear, and the particular staleness of air that had been breathed too many times by too many desperate people. Outside, the ground shook constantly. The American artillery never stopped. Day blurred into night, blurred into day. Time became measured not in hours, but in the intervals between explosions. Yuki clutched a small, smooth stone in her pocket, a river stone from the stream near her family home in Shuri. Her father had given it to her when she was 7. For luck, he'd said, for remembering where you come from. Her father was dead now, killed in the first week of the invasion. Her mother vanished, her home rubble. The stone was all she had left of the world before the Americans came. She thought of the cherry blossoms that used to bloom near Shuri Castle. She thought of her school uniform, crisp and clean, and the sound of morning assembly. She thought of the simple, structured world where teachers spoke truth, and the emperor was divine, and the path forward was always clear. The radio had told them exactly what the Americans did. The men would be tortured for intelligence, then executed. The women would be made into Yanfu comfort slaves for the occupying forces, passed between soldiers until they were broken, used and discarded, worse than death, infinitely worse than death. The thought was a cold sickness in her stomach. But could the truth be worse than these whispers in the dark? Could anything be worse than waiting in a tomb for devils who might never come? On the 5th day in the cave, or perhaps it was the 6th, Yuki lost count. A new sound penetrated the constant thunder of artillery. It was closer, sharper. Small arms fire, rifle shots, the distinctive rapid chatter of American machine guns, and voices, American voices, loud, aggressive, moving through the jungle in a systematic grid. The 77th Infantry Division was clearing the area around Arasoe. Corporal Thomas Brennan, 22 years old from Dayton, Ohio, was part of a fire team assigned to cave-clearing operations. It was the worst job in the worst battle in the worst war. They moved from cave to cave with flamethrowers and satchel charges and a Nisei interpreter with a loudspeaker who spoke Japanese with a California accent. Thomas had been on Okinawa for 3 weeks. Before that, Leyte in the Philippines. Before that, training in Hawaii, where the sun was warm and nobody was trying to kill him. He was exhausted. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The kind that settled into your bones and made you wonder if you'd ever feel truly awake again. His best friend, Sergeant Vincent Kowalski, everyone called him Gunny, had been on point that morning. They'd already cleared 4 caves. 2 were empty. One had a family that surrendered immediately, the father carrying his children out with his hands raised high. The 4th had opened fire. They'd used the flamethrower. Thomas tried not to think about the sounds that came from inside. The loudspeaker crackled to life. The Nisei interpreter, a kid from Los Angeles named Jimmy Tanaka, spoke clear, articulate Japanese into the megaphone. His voice echoed off the coral and jungle canopy. Come out. You will not be harmed. We have mizu, water. We have food. Come out slowly with your hands empty and visible. You will not be harmed. This is your last warning. Come out now. Inside the tomb, Haruko grabbed Yuki's arm hard enough to bruise. It is a lie. They want us to walk out. It is a trick. They will save us for later, for the night, for their pleasure. But starvation was a tyrant more immediate and more persuasive than propaganda. One of the old men, his body skeletal, his eyes sunken deep into his skull, stumbled toward the entrance. His voice was a dry croak. I am coming. Do not shoot. I am an old man. I am coming. There were shouts in English. Rough hands grabbed the old man, searched him for weapons, found nothing, pushed him to the side, but not violently, just firmly. Processing. The light stayed fixed on the tomb entrance. More Jimmy Tanaka's voice called. More come out, slowly. Hands visible. Yuki's legs trembled. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to stay in the dark, where at least the horror was familiar. But her throat was cracked leather. Her stomach had forgotten what food felt like. And some small, defiant part of her mind whispered a question she couldn't silence. If they just wanted to kill us, why offer water? Slowly, one by one, the small group emerged, blinking into the harsh gray afternoon light filtered through smoke and low clouds. An elderly woman, a young mother with 2 children clinging to her legs, 3 more women from the village, Haruko, and finally last Yuki. She kept her eyes on the ground. She expected a rifle butt to the face, a hand grabbing her hair, the beginning of the nightmare the radio had promised. Instead, she saw a pair of massive boots caked in red Okinawan mud, green canvas leggings wrapped tight. American Marine Corps utilities, though she didn't know the terminology. She looked up slowly. Past the boots, past the web gear hung with grenades and ammunition pouches, past the M1 rifle held at a casual ready position, to the face of the man wearing them. He was tall, impossibly tall compared to Japanese soldiers. His face was smeared with green and black camouflage paint. Dark stubble covered his jaw. His eyes were gray, the color of the smoke that covered the island. And he looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not lust, not cruelty, just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that somehow mirrored her own. He unclipped a K-ration box from his belt, small, olive-drab cardboard. He tossed it at her feet. It landed in the red dust with a soft thud. Jesus, he muttered to the sergeant next to him. Gunny Kowalski, she looks like Margaret's age. My kid's sister. Same eyes. Gunny said nothing, just spat a stream of tobacco juice and moved his attention to the next cave in the grid. Haruko saw the exchange. She pulled Yuki away roughly as they were herded into a single file line with the other captives. Do not look at them. Do not let them see your face. It is just as the commander said. They are separating us. They are choosing. The young ones. The ones they want. Yuki stared at the small box of crackers and processed cheese at her feet. It was the first real food she had seen in weeks, but her body was frozen. She couldn't bend down, couldn't pick it up. Some part of her still believed it was poison, or a trap, or a test of her loyalty to the emperor. The Americans moved them out, down the ridge toward the sound of truck engines. They were prisoners now. The women, including Yuki and Haruko, were loaded onto a 6x6 cargo truck with canvas sides. The engine roared to life, belching diesel smoke. As the truck lurched forward, Yuki looked back at the exhausted American soldier, Thomas Brennan. He wasn't looking at her. He was already scanning the next ridgeline rifle at the ready, moving forward in the endless mechanical process of clearing caves and counting the living and the dead. The fear in Yuki's chest, the cold, certain terror that had defined every moment since the Americans landed, was replaced by something more insidious. A new kind of dread. The propaganda had not been wrong, she thought. It had just been incomplete. The immediate violence hadn't come. But this slow, methodical processing felt colder, more terrifying. They were being taken somewhere, to be cataloged, penned, and used. General Buckner wanted the island secured. General Ushijima had issued his final order to the civilian population. Die with honor. The question that turned over and over in Yuki's mind as the truck bounced along the muddy coastal road was simple and terrible. Who would they obey? The truck ride was a symphony of mechanical violence. Grinding gears, the chassis bouncing over potholes and debris, the canvas sides snapping in the wind like rifle shots. Yuki was crammed between Haruko and a dozen other women, their bodies swaying as one mass with each lurch and turn. Through the gaps in the canvas, she caught fractured glimpses of a landscape dissolving into nightmare. Burned-out villages, rice paddies turned into impact craters, the skeletal remains of trees stripped bare by fire and shrapnel. Haruko's fingers dug into Yuki's arm. Her voice was a dry, insistent whisper, barely audible over the engine roar. They are taking us to the coast, just as the radio said. They will put us on ships, take us to their land. Or worse, they will use us here for the soldiers who are resting between battles. They will set up comfort stations. We will be numbered, registered, broken. Yuki said nothing. Her terror had reached a point beyond words. It had become a numb void. The propaganda had been a living thing, a shadow that had defined her world for months. The Americans were not just soldiers. They were a force of nature, a plague. To be captured by them was not merely a military outcome. It was a spiritual catastrophe. It meant the end of honor, the end of purity, the end of being Japanese in any meaningful sense. She was no longer a person. She was livestock being transported to slaughter. The truck shuddered to a halt. The engine died. The canvas was ripped back and sunlight flooded in painfully bright after the dimness. Out! Hayaku! Get out now! The voice was American, but the words were Japanese, barked by the Nisei interpreter, whose face was a mask of strained impatience and exhaustion. They were in a vast open field, enclosed by coils of barbed wire that glinted in the late afternoon sun. Tents stretched in neat, obsessive rows like a grid drawn by an engineer with no imagination. Watchtowers punctuated the perimeter, each one manned by helmeted soldiers with rifles. A sign painted on weathered plywood read, Tangan Civilian Internment Camp, U.S. Naval Military, Government, Okinawa. This was it, the processing, the beginning of the end. The women were herded forward, not violently, but with the muzzles of M1 rifles and impersonal firmness, like cattle being moved through a chute toward an inevitable destination. They were pushed into a long, single-file line that snaked toward a large tent with its sides rolled up. They are separating the men, Haruko observed. Her voice trembled between fear and a strange, desperate vindication. Look, they are counting us. See that one? The officer with the clipboard. He is looking at us, examining us. An American officer, a lieutenant with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipboard thick with papers, was indeed walking the line. But his gaze was not predatory. It was analytical. He seemed to be counting, estimating age groups, making notes in small, precise handwriting. We need more tents for this lot, he called to a sergeant. And get the medics ready. They all look like they've got scabies or worse. I want a full delousing before they go into general population. Yuki didn't understand the English words, but the tone was not one of lust. It was the tone of administration, of logistics, of a man with too many problems and not enough solutions and a profound desire to be anywhere else. The line shuffled forward. The stench grew stronger. Unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, and something else. A sharp chemical smell that made Yuki's eyes water. They were finally pushed into the processing tent, and the nightmare shifted into a new register of horror. Strip, all of you. Fuku onugu. The interpreter shouted the command with the mechanical precision of someone who had said the same words 100 times that week. The women froze. This was the moment. The final humiliation before the true horror. The moment the propaganda had warned them about. The moment that would prove every word of the Emperor's radio had been truth. Haruko let out a small, strangled sob and began to untie her filthy Mompe trousers with shaking hands. Yuki felt tears of shame sting her eyes, but her hands, stiff with fear, would not obey the command. She stood paralyzed. A new figure stepped forward. It was an American woman, tall, severe, wearing the olive drab uniform of the Army Nurse Corps. Her name tag read Goldstein in black letters. She was not smiling. Her face was set in the expression of someone who had seen too much and felt too little and just wanted the day to be over. Get them moving, Lieutenant Rachel Goldstein said to the interpreter. Her voice was clipped, efficient. We've got 300 more coming in from Nago by nightfall. I don't have all day. She saw Yuki's hesitation. She strode forward and with a rough practice motion grabbed the collar of Yuki's blouse and tore it open. Buttons scattered, fabric ripped. It wasn't sexual, it was pure, impatient utility. The way a farmer might handle a sheep that needed shearing. Yuki cried out and tried to shield her chest with her arms. But Goldstein was already turning away, pointing at two male soldiers standing by a strange contraption that looked like a mechanical sprayer. Delousing now, for they contaminate the whole camp. Before the women could react, before they could process what was happening, they were grabbed by the soldiers. Not roughly, not sexually, just with the same detached efficiency as the nurse. They were hustled under a nozzle and a cloud of fine white powder exploded over them. Cold, choking, stinging their eyes and filling their throats with a taste like bitter metal. It was DDT, dichlorodenphenotrichloroethane, the miracle insecticide. They were being sprayed from head to toe, the powder clinging to their hair and skin, turning them into ghost-like figures in a fog of white dust. Haruko was coughing, her eyes streaming, but still trying to cover herself with her hands. Yuki could barely breathe. The powder was in her mouth and her nose coating her tongue. Was this the torture? Some new American method of chemical warfare inflicted on prisoners? They were shoved still naked and powdered like bakery ghosts toward a row of makeshift showers. More soldiers stood guard, male soldiers, but they were not leering. One was smoking a cigarette, his gaze distant, looking through the women rather than at them. Another was reading a comic book, barely glancing up. The casual, impersonal nature of the violation was almost more disorienting than brutality would have been. The water was cold, harsh. They were thrown small, rough bars of lye soap that smelled of harsh chemicals, and nothing like the gentle soap Yuki remembered from before the war. Wash. All of it. Get the powder off. Move it along. After the shower, still shivering, they were given clothes. Not kimonos, not the modest dresses of Japanese women, but shapeless United States Army surplus. Khaki shirts and trousers still stuffed with factory sizing. The clothes of men, the clothes of the occupiers. And then the final confounding act. They were led to another tent, a mess hall. Each woman was handed a metal tray. A soldier wearing a stained white apron and an expression of infinite boredom scooped a ladle of thick brown stew onto each tray. A chunk of hard bread, a tin cup of water that didn't smell of sulfur or death. Yuki stared at the tray in her hands. The stew had an alien smell. Processed meat, onions, salt, fat. Steam rose from the surface. She hadn't seen this much food in one place in 6 months. Her stomach cramped with hunger so intense it felt like violence. Haruko moved with sudden vicious speed. She knocked the tray from Yuki's hands. It clattered to the dirt floor, spilling the precious food into the mud. No, Haruko hissed. Her eyes were blazing with desperate conviction and the terrible certainty of the true believer. It is poison. Or worse. They are fattening us, making us healthy before they use us. Like farmers fatten pigs before slaughter. Do not eat. It is a test of our spirit. We must die with honor, not as livestock for their tables. But Yuki was starving. The smell of the stew foreign as it was overwhelmed every other consideration. She watched another woman, a girl no older than 16, drop to her knees and begin eating the spilled food from her own tray, with her hands weeping as she ate. Slowly ignoring Haruko's gasp of betrayal, Yuki knelt in the dirt. She picked up her tray. She scooped a small amount of the stew with her fingers. She ate. It was not poison. It was not drugged. It was just food, salty, rich with fat, the kind of food she'd almost forgotten existed. It burned her shrunken stomach, but she didn't care. If this was not cruelty, then what was it? The next few days blurred into a routine of profound disorientation. The camp at Tangan was not a camp of torment. It was a camp of bureaucracy. They were registered, given identification numbers stamped on small pieces of cardboard hung around their necks. They were assigned sleeping mats and tents shared with 30 other women. They were put on work details, digging latrines, sorting medical supplies, hauling water from cisterns to the kitchens. The American soldiers were everywhere, but they were a paradox that Yuki's mind struggled to process. They were loud. They laughed at strange things. They chewed their gum with open mouths, a sign of profound disrespect in Japanese culture. They cursed constantly in their harsh, angular language. They were barbarians by every measure Yuki had been taught, but they were not the Hakujin devils. They did not drag women from the tents at night. They did not beat prisoners for pleasure. They did not inflict torture for information. They gave orders. They expected obedience. And most shocking of all, they largely left the prisoners alone when the work was done. The propaganda was a lie. The realization did not come as relief. It came as a terrifying void. If the Emperor's radio had lied about the Americans, what else had it lied about? The divine wind that would save Japan, the certain victory that would drive the white devils into the sea, the very nature of the war itself. Yuki's entire world, the one for which she had been willing to die in that tomb, was fracturing along invisible fault lines. Haruko, however, remained steadfast. She had retreated into a shell of rigid denial. She refused to speak to Yuki except to whisper warnings in the dark tent at night. They are patient. That is all. They are waiting, studying us. The war is not over. When they grow tired of this game, when their reinforcements arrive, or when they secure the island completely, the mask will fall. You will see. The radio was right. It has always been right. On the fifth day, Yuki was assigned to a work detail hauling jerrycans of water from a supply truck near the camp's main gate. The war was still audible, a constant dull thump of artillery from the south, where General Buckner's forces were relentlessly pushing against Ushijima's Shuri defensive line. The real fight was still raging miles away. The battle that would decide the fate of Okinawa and perhaps the war itself. A new contingent of American soldiers arrived to take over the guard shift. These were not fresh-faced military police. They were infantry, rotated off the front line for what the Army called rest. But rest was a bitter joke. Their faces were hollowed by fatigue and something worse than fatigue. Shell shock, the thousand-yard stare. Their uniforms were stained with the distinctive red mud of the Shuri front. One of them was assigned to the watchtower nearest Yuki's work detail. He climbed the wooden ladder slowly, each movement deliberate, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He reached the small platform at the top, leaned against the railing, and pulled off his helmet, ran a hand through sweat-matted hair, took a long drink from his canteen. Then he looked down into the compound. Yuki froze. The water can slipped from her hands, splashing muddy water over her bare feet. Her heart stopped, actually stopped for one terrible moment. It was him, the soldier from the cave, the one who had thrown her the K ration, the one with the impossibly tired gray eyes. It was Corporal Thomas Brennan. He had been pulled from the meat grinder of Shuri and reassigned to guard duty at Tangan. His gaze swept the compound in a cold professional arc, the automatic scan of a soldier checking for threats, until his eyes landed on her. Their gazes locked across 30 yards of mud and barbed wire and the unbridgeable distance between conqueror and conquered. He recognized her. She saw the recognition in his face, a slight widening of the eyes, a tension in his jaw. His expression didn't change otherwise, but his eyes held hers for a long, silent moment that stretched and bent time. Why was the soldier from the cave here? Why was he watching her? A new fear, different from the terror of the tomb, different from the confusion of the camp, began to twist in Yuki's stomach. The barbarians hadn't come to hurt her, but one of them had a face. And now he was here, watching, always watching. The camp at Tangan was a cage, but the true prison was the air between the watchtower and the dirt compound below. Corporal Thomas Brennan had become a fixture in that tower, a silent presence that overlooked the sector where Yuki worked. He never spoke. He never waved. He never acknowledged her existence beyond that constant, heavy gaze. But she could feel it on her back as she sorted supplies, as she hauled water, as she moved through the mechanical routines that defined her captive days. It was not the leering, hungry look she had been taught to expect from the Hakujin devils. It was something else entirely. Something she couldn't decipher with the limited tools her propaganda-saturated education had given her. It was an inventory of her existence. He watched her the way a man might watch a fragile object he'd once dropped, terrified it might shatter at any moment if he looked away. The other women noticed. Haruko's paranoia, which had been simmering in the face of American administrative indifference, now found a new specific target, a face for her fears, a validation of everything the Emperor's radio had promised. "He has marked you," Yuki-chan, Haruko hissed one night. They lay on their sleeping mats in the crowded, humid tent, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the residual chemical tang of DDT that never quite left their hair. The other women, they are just cattle to them, numbers on a list. But you? He looks at you like you are already his. He is waiting. This is how it begins. He is the Shoko, the officer who gets first choice when they finally stop pretending. "He is not an officer," Yuki whispered back, her heart pounding against her ribs. "He is just a Heiji, a common soldier, the one from the cave who gave me food." "Worse," Haruko snapped. Her voice carried the edge of vindication, as if Yuki's naivety only proved how correct Haruko had been all along. "A common brute pretending patience. Do not be fooled by their food and their powder and their false bureaucracy. A devil is still a devil even if he washes you before he consumes you, even if he feeds you before the slaughter. Yuki said nothing. She stared at the canvas roof of the tent where shadows moved in the light of distant fires. Haruko was wrong. Yuki knew it with a certainty that frightened her more than agreement would have. The fear she felt when Thomas Brennan watched her was not fear of violation. It was fear of connection, of being seen, of mattering to someone in a world where she had been reduced to a number on a processing card, a statistic in a report filed by exhausted officers who just wanted the war to be over. That single-focused gaze was a terrifying, almost seductive thing, because it meant she was still human, still individual, still real in a way the propaganda had tried to erase. Thomas Brennan kept a journal. He'd kept one since basic training, a small green canvas-covered field notebook issued by the Army and carried in the cargo pocket of his utilities. He wrote in it when he could, usually at night, by the light of whatever fire or lamp was available. Short entries, fragments of thought, the kind of writing a man does when he's trying to make sense of something that has no sense to be made. May 17, 1945. Got posted to Tengan. Supposed to be rest. It's not. The girl from the Urusui tomb is here. The one who looked like Mags. I see her every day. I'm supposed to be watching the wire for infiltrators, checking for gaps in the perimeter, maintaining security. But I'm just watching her. I see the ones we didn't get to. The ones we had to burn out of the caves because they wouldn't surrender. The old woman with the razor blade who'd already used it on the children before we could stop her. I see all of them in this one girl's face, and I feel like if I look away, she'll just disappear. Just stop existing. Like she's my responsibility now. Like she's my fault. Gunny says I'm spooked. Maybe I am. When I look at her, I don't see a Jap. I see my kid's sister. I see every scared kid who got caught in the middle of something they did not start and can't stop. I don't know what's worse anymore. Being on the line where you know who the enemy is, or being here where nothing makes sense. General Buckner was throwing everything at the Shuri defensive line. The 77th Infantry Division was in reserve, recovering from the brutal fighting at Yeshima and the northern Motobu Peninsula. But everyone knew they'd go back in soon. The Shuri line had to break. It was just a matter of time and blood, and how much of both Ushijima was willing to spend. Thomas should have been there with his unit, with Gunny and the rest of his fire team. Instead, he was here in this watchtower pretending to guard a camp full of starving civilians while his friends died in the mud. The guilt was a physical weight, but he couldn't request transfer back, not yet, not until he was sure the girl would be okay. Which was insane, which made no sense, but there it was. The war was still a beast roaring just beyond the hills to the south. In late May, the monsoon rains that had turned the Shuri line into a river of liquid red mud finally struck the coast. This was not rain. It was a deluge, a steel typhoon of wind and water that mirrored the violence of the human storm being fought in the ridges and valleys inland. The camp turned into a quagmire within hours. Tents collapsed under the weight of water. Latrines overflowed, mixing with the mud to create a slurry of filth. The wind shrieked through the barbed wire like a yurei, a tormented ghost from Okinawan folklore. Guard shifts were doubled because visibility dropped to nothing, and the fear of Japanese infiltrators using the storm as cover was real. On the third night of the typhoon, the war came closer. A stray Japanese artillery shell fired at maximum range from the collapsing Shuri front screamed overhead. It wasn't aimed at Tangan. Artillery at that range was barely aimed at all, but chance was the only god left on Okinawa, and chance was cruel. The shell struck the perimeter fence just yards from the supply depot, where Yuki's work detail had been frantically trying to secure canvas and equipment against the wind. The explosion was deafening. Not a direct hit on personnel, but the concussion was enough. The blast wave threw Yuki from her feet like a giant's hand had swatted her. She slammed into a stack of wooden crates. The world became a confusion of sound and pain and the sensation of falling even though she was already down. The main tent pole of the supply depot snapped with a crack like a rifle shot. The heavy, wet canvas collapsed. Ropes and debris and splintered wood crashed down. Yuki was trapped underneath. The weight of the soaked canvas was immense, pressing down on her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. She was drowning in mud and fabric under a black sky torn by lightning and the red glow of fires. This was it, a meaningless anonymous death in the dark, crushed under American equipment during an American storm while Japanese artillery tried to kill American soldiers. The irony would have been funny if she'd had enough air to laugh. Then hands, strong hands tearing at the canvas, a knife flashing in the intermittent lightning cutting through rope, a beam of light from a helmet-mounted lamp painfully bright, blinding her. "I got you. Hold on, just hold on." It was Thomas Brennan. He'd been on patrol checking the perimeter, not in the tower. He must have seen the explosion, seen the collapse. He sliced the canvas open with his K-bar knife and hauled her out bodily, one arm around her waist, pulling her from the wreckage like she weighed nothing. He dragged her through the sucking mud, her feet barely touching the ground, toward the relative shelter of a parked deuce-and-a-half truck. He pushed her against the hard steel of the truck bed, positioning himself between her and the wind, shielding her with his own body as the rain and wind tore at them both. His hands moved over her, quickly, professionally checking for injuries. "Are you hit? Are you hurt? Can you breathe? Talk to me." Yuki could only gasp. She was soaked to the bone, covered in mud, shaking so violently she couldn't stand without the truck supporting her weight. But she wasn't hurt. Not seriously, just terrified and shocked and suddenly overwhelmingly aware of the warmth of the body pressed against hers. He was solid, real, a fortress of muscle and bone and living heat against the chaos of the storm. His hands steadied her shoulders. His face was close to hers, close enough that she could see the individual drops of rain streaming down his skin, cutting tracks through the mud and camouflage paint. And then the world stopped. She looked up at him. His face was inches from hers, streaked with mud and rain and exhaustion. The propaganda had called men like him devils, monsters, beasts without souls or mercy. But this man had run toward an explosion to pull her from the wreckage. This man had shielded her with his own body. This man was looking at her not with lust or cruelty, but with something that looked almost like fear. Fear that she might be hurt. Fear that he might have been too late. He wasn't a devil. He wasn't a guard. He was just a man. And she was just a woman. And in that moment, stripped of propaganda and pretense and the lies that had defined both their worlds, there was only the simple animal truth of human warmth in a cold storm. All the terror of the past weeks, all the starvation and shame and profound, agonizing loneliness, all the times she'd felt like a ghost, invisible and unreal, it all coalesced into a single desperate impulse. The propaganda was a lie. Haruko was a lie. The only truth was the solid warmth of this man holding her upright in a typhoon. She didn't think. Thinking was what had kept her alive in the tomb, and thinking had failed her at every turn since. She acted on pure desperate instinct. She grabbed the front of his rain-soaked utility jacket with both hands, pulled herself up on her toes, and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or seduction. It was a kiss of desperation. A plea to be human, to be real, to be something other than a number or a ghost or a piece of livestock waiting for slaughter. It was every word she couldn't say in a language he would understand compressed into one moment of contact. For one heartbeat, Thomas Brennan froze. His entire body went rigid with shock. His mind, exhausted and traumatized and running on fumes, could not process what was happening. And then this haunted soldier who had seen nothing but death and horror for months, who was starving for any human contact that wasn't violent or transactional, who carried the weight of every cave and every burning and every scream, kissed her back. His hand moved from her shoulder to the side of her face, fingers spreading into her wet hair. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands that had thrown grenades and fired rifles and pulled bodies from rubble. For 5 seconds, maybe less, maybe an eternity, they were not prisoner and guard, not conqueror and conquered, not American and Japanese, just two terrified young people trying to find something solid in a world that had dissolved into chaos. Yuki pressed closer. This was safety. This was warmth. This was the one thing that made sense in a senseless world. She felt something electric and vital click into place. A moment of peace. The storm was ending the world, but this was real and good and right. And then Thomas tore himself away from her as if she had burned him. He stumbled back a step, breaking contact completely. His breath came in ragged gasps. His face in the flickering lightning was a mask of pure horror. Not horror at her, horror at himself. No. The word came out as a low growl forced through clenched teeth. God, no. What am I doing? No. Yuki stared at him, her lips still tingling, the cold rain hitting her face again, now that his body no longer shielded her. The rejection was more violent than any blow could have been. The shame she had expected to feel from the act of offering herself was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the crushing shame of this refusal. Get back to your tent, Thomas ordered. But his voice was broken, shattered. He didn't look at her. He pointed into the lashing rain with a shaking hand. Go, Ike. Now, it's not safe here. I can't, this isn't, I'm on duty. Go. The last word was an order, but it sounded like a plea. Yuki stood frozen for a moment, her entire world tilting on an axis she didn't understand. The barbarian had not taken what she offered. He had refused. The propaganda was not just wrong, it was an inverted, mocking parody of a truth she could not comprehend. Why would a man who could take anything choose nothing? She turned and fled, disappearing into the storm. The mud sucked at her bare feet. The rain blinded her, but she ran until she reached her tent and collapsed onto her sleeping mat, shaking with cold and shock, in a confusion so profound it felt like physical illness. Behind her, Thomas Brennan leaned his head against the cold steel of the truck. His fist was clenched, so tight his knuckles showed white even through the mud. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. He had crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. He had let himself forget for 5 seconds who he was and who she was, and what it meant to have power over another human being. He was supposed to be better than that. America was supposed to be better than that. 100 yards away, huddled in the doorway of a collapsing barracks building, Haruko Yamada watched. She had seen the American soldier pull Yuki from the wreckage. She had seen them go to the truck together. She had seen them in the dark, too far away to see details, but close enough to see bodies pressed together, to see the unmistakable silhouette of an embrace. And now she saw Yuki stumbling back alone, her clothes disheveled, her face a mask of something Haruko couldn't name. Not the broken emptiness of violation, but something else, something worse in Haruko's worldview. The look of someone whose certainties had just been shattered. Had the final dishonor finally come? And if so, why did Yuki look not violated but confused? Why did the American soldier look not satisfied but destroyed? The next morning the storm had passed. The camp was a disaster of mud and collapsed tents and overflowing latrines. Work details were doubled to clean up the mess, and Corporal Thomas Brennan, his face pale and set like stone, walked into the camp commandant's office and formally requested an immediate transfer back to his unit on the Shuri front line. Permission granted. The 77th was going back into the meat grinder anyway. They needed every rifle. By noon, Thomas was gone. The watchtower overlooking Yuki's sector was now occupied by a new guard, a lanky private from a quartermaster company, a rear echelon soldier who had never seen combat. He spent his shifts reading comic books, his rifle leaning forgotten in the corner. He did not look at the compound. He did not look at the prisoners. He was just a bored young man counting hours until his shift ended. He did not see Yuki. He saw nothing. Thomas Brennan was gone. The absence of his gaze was a new kind of violation. Yuki felt unmade, invisible. The single human connection she had found in this upside-down world, the one person who had seen her as an individual rather than a category, had been severed by its own intensity. The void he left behind was filled with a chilling, echoing shame. Haruko's suspicions had solidified into certainty. She saw Yuki's withdrawal, her hollowed-out expression, the way she moved through work details like a ghost. And Haruko interpreted it through the only lens she had left, the propaganda. The certainty that the Emperor's words were truth and American mercy was always a mask for cruelty. He took your honor, didn't he? Haruko confronted Yuki by the latrine trench 2 days after the storm. Her voice was low and venomous. The other women on the digging detail subtly moved away, creating a circle of isolation around the two of them. You let the Hakujin touch you in the storm. I saw you with him. I saw what happened. No, Yuki whispered. Her throat was so tight she could barely force words out. It wasn't like that. He didn't take anything. He saved me from the canvas, and then I was the one who he refused. He walked away. Do not lie to me. Haruko's eyes were fever-bright, burning with the terrible conviction of someone whose entire identity rested on being right about one thing. We saw. You were with him, and now he is gone. Satisfied, having taken what he wanted. And you are this. You are Kagare. Tainted, polluted. You smell of them now. Yuki recoiled as if Haruko had struck her. The accusation was a physical blow. She had not been violated. She had been rejected. But how could she explain that? How could she say the words, "I offered myself to the American devil, and he refused me in the name of his duty, his honor, his belief that taking from me would make him the monster the emperor said he was?" Such a truth was more insane than any lie the propaganda had ever broadcast. She was now an outcast twice over, a prisoner to the Americans, and a pariah to her own people. Had she traded one prison for another, this one built not of barbed wire, but of her own people's judgment? Miles to the south, the world was ending in liquid red mud. Corporal Thomas Brennan was back with the 77th Infantry Division. He had gotten his wish. His unit had been thrown back into the apocalypse. The final grinding assault on the Shuri defensive line. This was not war. It was a vertical battle against a subterranean fortress fought in a permanent monsoon. Men didn't walk, they clawed their way up ridges with names like Sugarloaf and Chocolate Drop and Conical Hill. The mud was so thick it sucked boots off feet and drowned wounded men where they fell, filling their mouths and noses before medics could reach them. The Japanese, under General Ushijima's unflinching command, fought from thousands of interlocking caves and tunnels. Every position had to be reduced individually. Every cave was a separate battle. Clarum. Sergeant Gunny Kowalski's voice was a raw shred of sound, barely audible over the rain and artillery. The word meant blowtorch and corkscrew, the technique for clearing caves. A flamethrower team would hose down the opening with liquid fire. Then an infantry team would rush in with satchel charges and clear the interior. Thomas was on the charge team. He was always first one in now. He moved with a cold, terrifying emptiness. The guilt from Tangan, the shame of that moment of weakness, of seeing that girl as a person and then failing her, failing himself, failing everything he believed America stood for, it had burned everything else out of him. He was no longer a man. He was a tool, a weapon aimed at caves. Cave on the left. Thomas scrambled over the slick coral, primed the satchel charge, and ran toward the blackness. A Nambu light machine gun opened up from inside the bullets, thacking into the mud around his boots. He didn't flinch, didn't duck, didn't care. He hurled the charge into the darkness and dove into a shell crater as the world erupted in fire and concussion behind him. Jesus. "Riley, you're going to get your head taken off," Gunny said. He grabbed Thomas's arm and hauled him up out of the crater. "You got a death wish or something." Thomas just wiped the muck from his rifle with mechanical precision. "One less cave," he said. His voice was flat, empty. "How many more we got?" Gunny stared at him. The kid who used to write letters to his mom and sister every week was gone. The man in his place was something else, something that frightened even a hardened sergeant who'd seen combat from Leyte to Okinawa. Could a man run from a ghost? Or did the mud of Okinawa just claim them both, the living and the haunted, and drag them down together into the red earth? The pressure on the Shuri line was relentless. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., frustrated by the slow, bloody progress and the mounting American casualties, was spending more time at the front than his staff thought wise. He was constantly pushing his commanders, demanding results, walking the ridgelines under fire to show his men that no position was too dangerous for the commanding general of the 10th Army. The Shuri line had to break. The invasion of mainland Japan was being planned, and Okinawa had to be secured first. At Tengen, the American victory in the south meant a new kind of work. The advancing forces were overrunning Japanese command posts, field hospitals, ammunition dumps, and headquarters positions. Mountains of captured material needed to be processed, documents translated, intelligence extracted, and personal effects sorted. Lieutenant Rachel Goldstein, the severe nurse from the delousing tent, was reviewing the prisoner rosters with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to every task. She needed workers for the battlefield intelligence processing, educated workers who could read, who could handle documents, who wouldn't cause trouble. Her finger stopped at a name: Shimizu Yuki, Himayori Student Corps. Mission School Education, Basic English. Currently assigned general labor. No disciplinary incidents. Status separated from main population by request of other internees. Goldstein looked up at her assistant. What does separated by request mean? The assistant, a corporal from Brooklyn, shrugged. Means the other Jap women don't want her around. Usually means they think she collaborated or fraternized. You know how it is. They police their own harder than we ever could. Goldstein made a notation on the roster. Perfect. She won't have divided loyalties. Get her transferred to document processing immediately. Yuki was moved to a small, heavily guarded cluster of tents away from the main camp. Her new duty was laid out on a series of long, rough wooden tables under canvas that snapped and billowed in the constant wind. She was given one job: sort the personal effects of dead Japanese soldiers. The items came in crates marked with unit designations and locations: Shuri, Naha, Yonabaru, Mabuni. Each crate was a catalog of ended lives. Simbari 1,000 stitch belts that mothers and wives had made each stitch a prayer for protection. Yosagaki flags signed by entire villages. Good luck messages from people who would never know their sons and brothers were dead. Letters written in beautiful calligraphy. Photographs of children. Locks of hair tied with silk thread. Poems written to mothers who would wait forever for soldiers who would never return home. Her job was to sit for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and sort these items. Intelligence value in one pile. Maps orders anything with military significance. Personal effects in another pile. To be cataloged, stored, and eventually perhaps returned to families if Japan ever surrendered, and if anyone cared enough to try. It was a meticulous, soul-destroying task. Each item was a story. Each photograph a life that had been extinguished in the mud and coral. Each letter a final thought that had never been completed. Yuki handled them with a reverence that the American guards didn't understand. To them, these were just enemy possessions. To her, they were sacred objects. The last physical connection between the dead and the world of the living. The American guards left her alone. They stood at a distance, smoking, talking in low voices, watching her with the same bored indifference they brought to all guard duties. They didn't understand what she was handling. They just wanted the items sorted so intelligence could do their job and the crates could be cleared out of the already overcrowded supply depot. On the third day of this new duty, a fresh load of crates arrived by truck. They were marked in white stenciled letters: Shuri 77th Infantry Division, KIA, killed in action. The crates smelled of mildew and something worse. The sweet, sick smell of death that no amount of rain could wash away. The distinctive red mud of the Shuri Ridges mud that was more blood than earth covered everything. Yuki put her hand into a crate filled with soaked leather pouches and personal items sealed in oilcloth that had failed to keep out the moisture. Her fingers closed around a small, hard, rectangular object. She pulled it out. It was a notebook, a field journal. The green canvas cover was soaked and stained with dark red-brown mud that had dried into stiff patches. It was not Japanese. The cover had English words stamped in black ink. U.S. Army Field Message Book. Her heart stopped. Actually stopped for one terrible moment before restarting with a painful lurch. With trembling fingers that barely obeyed her commands, she opened the cover. The first few pages were a wash of blurred ink ruined by rain and mud, but then protected by the ruined pages before it, she found entries that were legible, written in a strong angular hand in pencil that had survived what ink could not. Her broken English learned in the mission school in Shuri was enough. She could read this. And what she read made the world tilt on its axis. May 17, 1945. Got posted to Tangan. Supposed to be rest. It's not. The girl from the Urasoe tomb is here. The one who looked like Mags. Yuki's breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to see a name. She knew this handwriting, knew it in her bones. It was Thomas Brennan's journal. The soldier from the cave. The soldier from the tower. The soldier from the storm. She looked up quickly, her eyes wide with a terrible new fear. The guards were 20 feet away, their backs turned, sharing a cigarette and complaining about the heat. They weren't looking at her. She slipped the journal under the folds of her work trousers, pressing it flat against her stomach. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain everyone in the camp could hear it. Why was his journal here? Why was it in a crate marked "Killed in Action"? Was Thomas Brennan dead? Had he died after leaving Tungan? After walking away from her in the storm, that night in her solitary tent, away from the main population by the light of a candle stub, she'd traded half her dinner ration for. Yuki began to read. She read slowly, carefully, her mission school English, struggling with some of the words in the abbreviated military terminology. But she understood enough. More than enough. She read about his sister Margaret in Dayton, Ohio, 16 years old, how she wanted to join the Women's Army Corps and their mother was having fits about it. How Margaret was the reason Thomas kept going, kept fighting, kept trying to stay alive, to make the world safe for girls like his sister. She read about his friendship with Sergeant Vincent Kowalski Gunny, who'd been with him since Leyte. How Gunny could make him laugh even in the worst moments. How Gunny kept saying they'd make it home and open a bar together in Cleveland. She read about his fear of the caves, the horror of what they found inside, the families who chose death rather than surrender because of what they'd been told about American soldiers. April 28, 1945. Cleared another cave today. Used the loudspeaker. Nisei interpreter told them to come out. Nothing. Then the scream started inside. Not from us, from them. We found mothers and children later. They'd done it to themselves. Gunny was sick. We all were. I don't know what to write to Mom anymore. How do you tell your mother that you're fighting people so scared of you they'd rather kill their own children than let you help them? How do you explain that the enemy isn't the Japanese army? It's the lies they've been told about us. She read about herself, about how seeing her in the camp affected him. May 18th, 1945. I see her every day. The girl from the tomb. She looks like Mags. Same age, same eyes, same fear. I see the ones we didn't get to in every cave. The old woman with the razor blade who'd already used it on the children before we could stop her. The mother who jumped off the cliff with her baby rather than let us capture them. I see all of them in this one girl's face, and I feel like if I look away from her, she'll just disappear. Just stop living. Like she's my fault. Like all of them are my fault. Like if I can just keep her alive, keep her safe, maybe it balances out all the ones I couldn't save. I know that's crazy. Gunny says I'm losing it. Maybe I am, but I can't look away. And then she reached the entry about the storm. The entry that explained everything and nothing. May 22nd, 1945. Storm hit hard. Artillery struck the perimeter fence. Found her trapped under collapsed tent. Pulled her out. And she kissed me. This terrified kid who's been taught I'm a monster. She kissed me because I was warm and real. And she's so alone she can't see straight anymore. And for 5 seconds, I almost forgot everything. Forgot I'm a soldier. Forgot she's a prisoner. Forgot that I have all the power and she has none. Forgot everything except that she's a person and I'm a person and we're both so tired of being scared and alone. But I can't. I won't be that. I won't be the Hakujin devil their radio talks about. I won't prove their propaganda right. If I take from her, even if she offers it, even if she wants it, I'm exactly what they said I'd be. I'm a thief. I'm a monster who uses power and fear and gratitude to take what I want from someone who can't say no because I'm the one with the gun. I am a soldier of the United States Army. I represent something better than that. We're supposed to be the good guys. We're supposed to be different from the Germans, from the Japanese, from every other conquering army in history. Even if it kills me, I have to be better than what they think I am. I have to prove the propaganda is a lie. Requested transfer back to the line. It's the only place that makes sense anymore. Back where the rules are simple. Where I know who I'm supposed to shoot and who I'm supposed to save. I'd rather face the Nambu machine guns than her eyes. I'd rather die in the mud than become what they said I'd be. Yuki's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the journal. He had not refused her because she was tainted or worthless or beneath him. He had refused her to protect himself, to protect his own last sliver of honor, to protect his identity as a man, as an American, as something more than a conqueror who takes what he wants because he can. She kept reading. The later entries from the Shuri front grew darker, the handwriting more cramped and hurried. May 25th, 1945. Back with the 77th. Shuri line is pure hell. Mud's so thick it drowns wounded men where they fall. Gunny and I are on flamethrower assault teams. Cave after cave after cave. The Japanese don't quit. They fight until we burn them out or blow them up. Neither do we. This isn't war anymore. It's just killing. May 28, 1945. Buckner came up to the line today, walked around like he's bulletproof. Officers that high up aren't supposed to do that, but I guess he figures if he's asking us to die for these ridges, least he can do is show his face. Ushijima's falling back, but he's making us pay for every yard. It's almost over. Everyone can feel it. But almost over doesn't mean anything when you're the one who gets hit. May 30th, 1945. Gunny's down, mortar round, took half his face. He died in my arms. Took him 3 minutes. Felt like 3 hours. He said, "You did right, Tom. That girl in the camp. You did right. You're a better man than me. I don't know what right means anymore. I don't know if anything I do matters. I don't know if..." The entry stopped abruptly. The rest of the page was obliterated by a massive dark stain that had soaked through the next 10 pages, gluing them together into a solid block. The stain was stiff and black and unmistakably blood. Dried blood that had drenched the journal and everything in the pack that contained it. Yuki tried desperately to separate the pages. She couldn't. They were fused together as if they'd been welded. But through the thin paper backlit by her candle, she could see the ghost of words. The shadow of a final message written in increasingly erratic handwriting. She could make out fragments. "If I don't, Mom and Mags, tell them. 428. Tried." Thomas Brennan had written something on that blood-soaked page. A final message, an address, words he wanted delivered to his family if he died. And then his blood had come and sealed the words away like a wax seal on a letter that would never be opened. The journal fell from Yuki's trembling hands. She sat in the flickering candlelight, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking with sobs she couldn't control. The propaganda had been a lie. Haruko's accusations were a lie. The shame Yuki felt was built on lies. The only truth was this book, this testament of a man who had died in the mud, written in his own hand, explaining that he had seen her, had valued her, had protected her from himself. She clutched the journal to her chest. It was the only real thing she owned, the only proof that the last month of her life had meaning. She would not turn it in to the guards. She would not let it be filed away as a personal effect forgotten in some warehouse. This was her burden now, her sacred trust. The war ended not with a bang or a formal surrender, but with 2 final seismic deaths that closed the book on the Battle of Okinawa. June 18th, 1945. A rumor swept through Tangdon camp brought by fresh-faced replacements rotating in from the secured north. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was dead. He had been at the front as he always was, observing an attack on a ridge near Zato. A Japanese artillery shell, one of the last rounds fired by the dying 32nd Army, had struck an outcrop of coral. The fragments had torn through the general like shrapnel from a grenade. The man who had commanded the conquest of Okinawa did not live to see the island secured. He died in the mud with his men 3 days before the battle ended. Then 4 days later, on June 22nd, a new profound silence fell over the island. The constant thump of artillery from the south, the sound that had been the background music of their lives for 3 months, finally stopped. Completely. The guards in the towers seemed to relax their shoulders, slumping. The war was over. That night, the news passed from American interpreters to prisoner trustees, and finally to the general population. It became official. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Cho, had committed seppuku in their command cave at Mabuni. The 32nd Army had ceased to exist. The Battle of Okinawa was over. The Americans had won. The camp was overcome by a strange, suffocating atmosphere. It was not joy, for the thousands of Okinawan civilians at Tengen, victory and defeat were meaningless abstractions. Their world had already ended. What replaced the sound of artillery was not peace, but a profound, disorienting emptiness. Yuki saw Haruko Yamada near the water pump on the morning of June 23rd. The older woman's face was gray, her eyes hollow. The rigid certainty that had sustained her through capture and internment had evaporated, leaving nothing behind but a shell. "They are dead," Haruko whispered. Her voice was hollow, mechanical. "General Ushijima is dead. By his own hand. He has abandoned us, left us here with them." The Emperor lied about the divine wind, about the victory, about the Americans, about everything. Everything was a lie. Yes, Yuki said quietly. Her voice was steady, calm. We were lied to, but we are alive. Haruko looked at Yuki, truly looked at her for the first time in weeks. She saw no shame in Yuki's face, no taint, no brokenness. She saw only a vast, cold calm, an acceptance that Haruko could not comprehend. What will we do? Haruko asked. The question of a lost child. Where will we go? How can we be Japanese in an American world? How can we live knowing everything we believed was false? We will live, Yuki replied simply. That is what we will do. We will live because the alternative is to let the lies win. She turned and walked away, leaving Haruko standing by the pump, a ghost haunted by the death of her own certainties. That night, Haruko Yamada hanged herself in the women's latrine. She used a strip torn from her shirt and a roof beam. The guards found her at dawn. She left a note written in careful characters on a piece of cardboard from a ration box. I cannot live in a world where the emperor lied. I cannot be Japanese in an American world. I was taught the Americans were devils. I was wrong. But being wrong means everything I believed, everything I was, everything I taught my children before they died was a lie. I cannot carry that. Forgive me. I go to join the ancestors who knew the truth. Yuki was brought to identify the body. She looked at Haruko's face, peaceful in death, in a way it had never been in life, and understood with terrible clarity. Haruko was what Yuki could have become. Thomas Brennan had not just saved her from the cave, from the storm, from starvation. He had saved her from this, from the inability to accept that the world was not what she'd been taught. His refusal, his honor, his insistence on being better than the propaganda had given Yuki something Haruko never found. A reason to believe that truth was possible, that goodness existed even across the battle lines. A week later, the gates of Tengen were opened, not torn down. The barbed wire remained. But it was no longer a cage. It was just a fence. The women were lined up one final time. Lieutenant Goldstein stood with the camp commandant reading from a list of assignments. Shimizu Yuki. Goldstein's voice was flat, exhausted. You're assigned to the Koza Camp Medical Detail. You'll assist the nurses with Okinawan civilian casualties. Goldstein paused, then handed Yuki a small stack of papers. New identification, ration card, work permit. You're not Himeyori anymore. You're not military auxiliary. You're a civilian. Try to stay that way. Yuki bowed, took the papers, and walked through the gate with Thomas Brennan's journal pressed flat against her stomach, hidden beneath her surplus army shirt. She stepped out into the blinding white sunlight of a ruined world. The hills that had once been covered in pine forest were now bare red-brown scars. The villages were rubble. The air smelled of salt water and lime from bodies still buried in collapsed caves. She was 19 years old and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. But she was not broken. She was a survivor of the steel typhoon. She was the unlikely keeper of an American soldier's memory. And as she began the long walk toward Koza, she understood what she would become. Over the following years, Yuki Shimizu worked at the Koza medical camp as a translator for the American military government. And in quiet moments, sitting with other women who had survived the battle and were struggling to survive the peace, she would tell them a story. Let me tell you about an American soldier. I was taught he would be a monster, but when I offered myself to him in desperation, he refused. Not because I was worthless, but because taking from me would make him the monster the emperor said he was. He chose honor over desire. He chose duty over comfort, and he died for it. If one American can be that man, then the propaganda was a lie. If the propaganda was a lie, then we can build new lives on truth instead of fear. We can live. Over 7 years, Yuki Shimizu saved 47 women from Haruko's fate. 47 times she told the story of Thomas Brennan. 47 times she showed them that survival was not dishonor, that the world, though broken, was not irredeemable. And every night she studied English. She worked through the blood-stained journal, learning each word, understanding each entry, and she became obsessed with the blood-soaked pages she could not separate, the pages that contained Thomas Brennan's final message. In September 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Yuki Shimizu finally had enough English to ask for help. She took the journal to the library at Kadena Air Base. An American librarian, Mrs. Patricia Chen, a kind woman in her 60s with gentle hands and patient eyes, agreed to help. The process took over an hour. Steam, archival tools, careful patience, and finally the pages separated. Yuki held her breath as Mrs. Chen laid the blood-stained page flat under a reading lamp. The handwriting was shaking, growing more erratic toward the bottom. The words were written in the spaces between dark brown stains. May 30th, 1945, 1800 hours. Gunny died in my arms. Shrapnel from mortar took half his face. Before he went, he said, "You did right, Tom. That girl in the camp. You did right. You're a better man than me. I don't know what right means anymore. I don't know if anything I do matters. If I don't make it, and it looks like I won't the way things are going. Mom Mags, I love you. Don't cry too long. I tried to be the man you raised." Addressed Dorothy and Margaret Brennan, 428 Rosewood Avenue, Dayton, Ohio. If someone finds this journal, tell my family about the girl from the Okinawan tomb, the one who looked like Mags. Tell them I wasn't a devil. Tell them I tried to be the American we say we are, the one who doesn't take, who doesn't conquer, who just helps. Tell her the girl, if she survived, I'm sorry I couldn't do more. I'm sorry I left her alone. But I'm not sorry I walked away that night in the storm. It was the last good thing I did. The last time I got to be the man I wanted to be instead of the weapon they needed me to be. Tell them I tried. Corporal Thomas J. Brennan, 77th Infantry Division. P.S. Mags, stay out of the wax. Mom needs you home. Yuki collapsed into a chair. Mrs. Chen held her shoulders as she wept. He had left an address. He had wanted his family to know about her. He had wanted her to know that walking away had been his choice, his last act of honor. Mrs. Chen spoke gently. Then you have to go, dear. You have to finish this for him. And so in September 1952, Yuki Shimizu took her savings and bought a plane ticket to San Francisco. From there, a Greyhound bus to Dayton, Ohio. She was 26 years old. She had never left Okinawa before the war. Now she was traveling to the heart of America carrying a dead soldier's journal and a promise she had made to a ghost. She found herself standing across the street from a small white house with a neat lawn and an American flag hanging from the porch. 428 Rosewood Avenue. She stood there for 2 days, unable to approach. What right did she have to reopen this family's grief? What could she possibly say that would matter? But on the third day, she remembered Thomas's words. Tell them I tried. And she walked up the steps and knocked on the door. Margaret Brennan Foster answered. She was 23 now, married with a baby on her hip. She looked exactly like the photograph Thomas had carried. Dark hair, kind eyes, the sister he had died trying to protect. Mrs. Foster, Yuki said carefully in her accented but clear English. My name is Yuki Shimizu. I am from Okinawa. I knew your brother, Corporal Thomas Brennan. I have something that belongs to your family. She held out the journal wrapped in clean cloth, offering it with both hands like the sacred object it was. Margaret stared. Her face went pale. The baby on her hip began to fuss, but she didn't seem to notice. She called into the house, her voice shaking. Mom, you need to come here right now. Dorothy Brennan appeared in the doorway, 59 years old now, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, a face lined with grief that had never fully healed. She looked at Yuki, looked at the wrapped package, and somehow she knew. Come in, she said. Her voice was steady despite the tears already forming in her eyes. Please come in. The living room was small and neat, photographs on the mantel, a folded American flag in a triangular case. Dorothy gestured to the sofa and disappeared into the kitchen. She returned with tea in china cups, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. Yuki sat with the journal in her lap, still wrapped. Margaret sat across from her, the baby now quiet in her arms, staring at Yuki with wide, curious eyes. How did you know my brother? Dorothy asked quietly. Yuki took a breath. Your son saved my life. Twice. First from a cave where I was ready to die because I believed the propaganda about American soldiers. He gave me food and walked away. Then he was assigned to guard the camp where I was held. I saw him every day in the watchtower. I didn't understand why he watched me. I thought it meant something terrible. She paused, gathering courage. Then there was a storm. An artillery shell hit near where I was working. I was trapped under collapsed canvas. Your son ran toward the explosion. He pulled me out. He shielded me with his body. And then Yuki's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I was so frightened and so alone, and he was the only person who had seen me as human. I kissed him. I offered myself to him because I thought it was what he wanted, what all American soldiers wanted. Margaret gasped. Dorothy's teacup froze halfway to her lips, but he refused me. Yuki continued, tears now streaming down her face. He pushed me away, told me to go back to my tent. I thought it was because I was worthless, because I was Japanese, because I was the enemy. I felt such shame. She unwrapped the journal and placed it on the coffee table between them. Then I found this, in a box of belongings from soldiers killed at Shuri. I stole it, I read it, and I understood. He refused me not because I was worthless, but because taking from me would make him the monster my government said he was. He chose to suffer rather than compromise what he believed America should be. He chose honor over desire, and then he went back to the front line and died. Dorothy reached out with trembling hands and picked up the journal. She opened it slowly, saw her son's handwriting, and made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Margaret moved to sit beside her mother, reading over her shoulder. They read the entry about Margaret, about how Thomas wanted to keep her safe. Dorothy wept openly. They read about Gunny, about the caves and the horror and the exhaustion. And then they reached the entry about the storm. I won't be the Hakujin devil their radio talks about. I won't prove their propaganda right. Dorothy looked up at Yuki, her face wet with tears. He never told us. In his letters home, he never mentioned you. Never mentioned the storm or the camp or any of it. He just wrote about the weather and the food and asked about Margaret's schoolwork. Margaret turned to the blood-stained pages at the end. Her hands shook as she read her brother's final words. Tell them I wasn't a devil. Tell them I tried. She looked up at Yuki. Why did you wait 7 years to bring this to us? Yuki met her eyes steadily. Because I needed to become someone worthy of keeping his memory. I was 19, broken, ashamed. I thought I had done something wrong. But your brother's journal taught me that I hadn't, that the propaganda was the lie, not American mercy. She leaned forward, urgent now. I used his story. For 7 years, I worked with women who had survived the battle, women who were on the edge of despair, women who believed what I had believed, that to be captured by Americans was worse than death. I sat with them. I told them about your son, about the soldier who refused to be the monster, about the man who chose honor even when no one was watching. How many? Dorothy whispered. 47 women, Yuki said. 47 times I told the story of Thomas Brennan. 47 women who were going to follow my friend Haruko into suicide. She hanged herself the night the war ended because she couldn't live in a world where everything she believed was a lie. But I could, because your son showed me that truth was possible, that one man's choice could break the power of propaganda. She looked between Dorothy and Margaret. Your son did not die for nothing. He died so that 47 women could choose life over lies. He died so that I could show others what America truly is. Not perfect, but capable of mercy, capable of honor, capable of being better than the enemy's propaganda. Dorothy stood slowly. She walked to Yuki and pulled her into an embrace. Yuki stiffened in shock, then slowly relaxed, her sobs coming freely now. You didn't bring him home, dear, Dorothy whispered into her hair. You are his home. You are the living proof that what he did mattered. You are the keeper of what he stood for. Margaret joined the embrace, the baby squeezed gently between them. The three women stood together in the small living room in Dayton, Ohio, connected across oceans and years, in the unbridgeable distance between enemy nations by the memory of one soldier's choice. The next morning, Dorothy and Margaret took Yuki to Dayton National Cemetery. They walked through neat rows of white headstones until they found the one they were looking for. Corporal Thomas J. Brennan, 77th Infantry Division, 1923 to 1945. Bronze Star. Dorothy placed the journal on the grass in front of the headstone. He's been home all along, but now his story is complete. Now we know what the Bronze Star was really for. Not just for bravery under fire, but for being brave enough to walk away. Yuki knelt and touched the cold marble. She spoke in Japanese first, then repeated it in English, so Dorothy and Margaret could understand. Thank you for showing me that honor has no nationality, that one man can change a world, that the propaganda was a lie. I kept my promise. I told them you tried. I told them you weren't a devil. And I told 47 others. Your sacrifice rippled across years and lives you'll never know. You saved more people by walking away than you ever could have by staying. She stood. Dorothy handed her a folded piece of paper. That's our address and telephone number. You're not a stranger, Yuki. You're family now. You're the daughter Thomas saved. Write to us. Visit when you can. Let us know how you're doing. Yuki returned to Okinawa a week later. She left the journal with the Brennan family. It had always been theirs. She had only been the keeper, the messenger, the bridge between a dead soldier's honor and the family he died protecting. But she carried something more valuable than the journal itself. She carried the knowledge that her life had meaning, that she had taken one man's sacrifice and multiplied it 47 times, that she had turned a moment of refusal into a lifetime of affirmation. In 1975, Yuki Shimizu, now 49 years old, testified before the United States-Japan Joint Commission on POW treatment. She brought a photocopy of Thomas Brennan's journal. Her testimony helped shape the official narrative of American restraint and adherence to the Geneva Convention during the Okinawa campaign. She spoke of the delousing that had seemed like torture but was actually medicine, the food that had seemed like poison but was actually mercy, the bureaucracy that had seemed like cruelty but was actually processing to save lives. And she spoke of one soldier who had embodied what America claimed to be, who had chosen the harder path because it was the right path, whose refusal to take had given her the strength to give. In 1985, at age 59, Yuki attended the dedication of the Himeyuri Peace Museum in Okinawa. She was a guest of honor, a survivor who had bridged the gap between enemy and ally, between propaganda and truth, between war and peace. Margaret Brennan Foster stood beside her. Now 56, a grandmother, she had brought her own children to see the place where their uncle had fought and where a young woman had learned that enemies could become family. The two women, once separated by propaganda and war and an ocean of lies, stood together as living proof that one man's choice to be better than expected could echo across generations. Yuki Shimizu passed away in 2004 at the age of 78. She died in a small apartment in Naha, surrounded by photographs. Photographs of the women she had counseled. Photographs of Dorothy and Margaret Brennan. Photographs of the Himeyuri Peace Museum, where her testimony was displayed. Her last words spoken to a young nurse who was caring for her were in English. Tell them I kept the promise. Tell them the story doesn't end. Tell them that one man's honor can save a world one woman at a time. The journal of Corporal Thomas J. Brennan remains with the Brennan family to this day. It has been read by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It has been loaned to museums and returned home. It sits in a glass case in the living room of Margaret Brennan Foster's daughter, a reminder that in the middle of the worst war in human history, one exhausted soldier chose to be better than he had to be. And because of that choice, a young woman learned to live instead of die. And because she lived, 47 others lived. And because they lived, their children lived, and their grandchildren. A legacy counted not in medals or monuments, but in the quiet accumulation of lives that would not have existed if one man had taken what was offered instead of walking away. Thomas Brennan died in the mud of Okinawa believing he had failed, that his death would be meaningless, that he was just another casualty in a war too big for individual choice to matter. But Yuki Shimizu spent 59 years proving him wrong, proving that one moment of honor in a typhoon could become a lifetime of salvation, proving that the propaganda was the lie and mercy was the truth, proving that even in hell, even when no one is watching, even when the easier path is right there within reach, some men choose to be better. And that choice, that single impossible choice, can save a world.